Welcome to PMP Lesson 4, Scope Planning. In this lesson, we'll be discussing the three major aspects of planning your scope: collecting requirements, defining your scope, and creating something called the work breakdown structure. PMI says scope planning sets the stage for the entire project because it affects all the other constraints as well as risk, resources, and procurement. If a project is to be successful, these three steps have to be done. This is just an example of the WBS with a dictionary included in a spreadsheet program. Basically, you have the element name, the definition of the element. If there's a cost control number, you can use that. I also like to list who the responsible organization is, so when I begin estimating my resources, I know which departments to go look for to find the experts that I need to do the work based on the definition and the breakdown in the WBS. There are other breakdown structures to be aware of, a couple things that we're going to discuss later on in the class. You have an organizational breakdown structure, or OBS. These are especially good for the project itself, who's in charge of making decisions. It's just a hierarchical, organized depiction of the project organization. You also have a risk breakdown structure, which is also hierarchical, and it's organized by risk categories that have been identified per work package. And then a resource breakdown structure, which is hierarchical as well. And basically, it's just a breakdown of the resources by group or type. Notice the acronym for both are RBS, but on the exam, you'll be able to tell because it's two different knowledge areas, risk and resources. So how will you create your WBS on the next project? Are you going to continue placing things in the order in which they occur? Or will you give this a try? Decomposing the scope, dumping out the puzzle pieces, and getting organized. What categories or groups will you use to make sure that everything's documented? Will you create this or begin to create it in your kickoff meeting? And will your team help you? I mean, you can't be responsible for doing everything. In fact, PMI says creation of the WBS can be used as a team building activity. That way everybody gets to know what everybody else is responsible for, and there can be really good discussions on how they can help each other execute the scope of work. Major outputs for this process include the scope baseline. The scope baseline is a compilation of three major scope documents: the approved scope statement, the WBS, and the WBS dictionary. Those are the scope statement, the WBS, and the WBS dictionary. Those make up the scope baseline. It will also document how scope will be measured for success as far as what we know right now. And ultimately, that baseline is going to get locked down and only be changed through integrated change control and approved implemented changes. But that scope baseline is probably one of the most important, and it will live in the project management plan. Other document updates that you could do after creating the WBS is going back and updating stakeholder requirement documentation, as well as the project management plan itself. Any updates that are necessary based on this creation of this most important document. Just to review, for Lesson 4, we discussed all the scope planning aspects, including the collection of requirements, making sure that we know what our stakeholder requirements are. Then we defined the scope to create a comprehensive scope statement, which will define what is and what is not included in the scope of work. We used that approved scope statement to create our WBS and our WBS dictionary. We've covered quite a bit so far, actually, so I just wanted to go back and kind of wrap up everything that we've discussed so far. We started with an introduction to project management and some terminology, including what's a project and what is project management. Then we went into project initiation in integration, and the project charter was developed by the sponsor. Then we went into initiation in communication, where you pick up and begin identifying requirements of your stakeholders. Once that was complete, we were able to go into planning and integration and begin developing our project management plan, which will definitely be progressively elaborated and contain all management plans across all knowledge areas. And then we just wrapped up project planning and scope, collecting requirements, defining the scope, and ultimately creating our WBS and our scope baseline. Couple different types of scope that have to be planned for. You have project scope and product Scope. Project scope is the work that needs to be done to deliver that product, the product, service, or result within the specified features, functions, and requirements. It's what the project looks like. Product scope, on the other hand, are the features and functions that characterize that deliverable, that product, service, or result. It's what the product or deliverable actually looks like. And according to PMI, planning for both is crucial to making sure that scope is clearly defined. Collecting requirements is the first piece of this. This is the process of defining and documenting product and project features and functions. Overall, meeting requirements is the most important thing. Not only that, but expectations and perceptions are involved here as well. So you'll have to gather the requirements, analyze them, record them in enough detail so that you can define them clearer and begin to plan for execution. Their requirements will actually be documented on a couple different things: the work breakdown structure, the requirements management plan, and something called a requirement traceability matrix. All of these are major outputs of scope planning, and project success is directly related to this particular process. When we look at the inputs, you're going to see something called the project charter again, and then that stakeholder register, which lists all stakeholder requirements. Now we're getting into more tools and techniques. PMI isn't saying use them all. They're saying choose the ones that work the best to collect requirements. Things like interviewing, focus groups, facilitated workshops, creative decision-making, observation, questionnaires, and prototypes. How your organization collects requirements is completely up to you. Major outputs are going to be stakeholder requirement documentation, a requirement management plan, and something called a traceability matrix, tracing requirements back to the stakeholders. During collection of requirements, there are several tools and techniques, one of which is group decision-making techniques. And the only reason that I bring this up is because PMI has a favorite. You can make decisions that are unanimous or majority rule. However, PMI's favorite is reaching consensus, and a lot of decisions have to be made in order to accurately plan the scope of work and define it and collect requirements. So they like consensus. However, there are going to be times where dictatorship is necessary and you'll have to make decisions for the overall group. But for you exam people, if PMI asks you, what's the number one group decision-making technique? The correct answer is consensus. Major outputs for collecting requirements are going to be your stakeholder requirements documentation, a requirements management plan, and then something called a requirements traceability matrix. What are these documents? Well, stakeholder requirement documentation documents how individual requirements meet the business need. This could be high level at this point and then progressively elaborated on later. Some common headers for requirement documentation are business problems to be solved, any objectives for traceability, meaning you're tracing back requirements to individual stakeholders, any functional or non-functional requirements, quality requirements, rules and regulations, internal, external, training requirements, assumptions and constraints. Ultimately, you're just building on the documentation that you already have from identification of stakeholders. The requirement management plan is a little bit more specific. It documents how requirements will be analyzed, documented, and managed throughout the project. And it could include how you're going to plan, track, and report on them, configuration management or how changes will be managed to those requirements, which requirements carry the most priority, what the metrics are for tracking performance, and what attributes will be captured on the traceability matrix and other documentation as we go forward. The requirements traceability matrix is just a table that links requirements to their origin. Which stakeholder discovered that requirement? Which stakeholder recommended that requirement? And basically, it just provides a structure, because if a requirement needs to be changed later on, you need to know which stakeholder to go back to approve that change. So some of the requirements that get documented here are business problems, opportunities, requirements to scope, deliverables, test strategies, scenarios. Whether it's high-level requirements or detailed requirements, it doesn't really matter. You want